Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I wish to thank Lutz Lange and the organizers of this conference for inviting me to speak to you here, and I hope it will be of interest to you. This is perhaps not self-evident because, just as has been said, I'm going to talk about a few theoretical issues that, however, I think have important practical implications for both management practice and the practice of management education. You may have noticed that I've slightly changed the order of the keywords in my title. I've done so because this will be the order in which I will talk about them. I shall start with a few basic reflections on responsibility in the context of prime and received use of CSR, and I will raise a few questions in this respect. In the next step, I'm going to focus on moral responsibility from the point of view of moral psychology. In this light, a very serious problem becomes very salient with respect to bridging rationality and responsibility. This should make us concerned, especially as educators. In what remains, I will indicate how I think this problem can and should be solved, and what this would mean for our conception of moral responsibility in general, and with respect to management education in particular. We are to educate morally responsible managers, and we are here to talk about how to do that. First of all, however, we would have to know what responsibility means. Based on the principles of responsible management education, this relates to the values that we have to convey to students and professionals. And these values are those mentioned in the Global Compact. That is, values concerning respect for human rights, labor principles, meeting environmental challenges, and fighting corruption. Well, but how far can and should that go? To what extent do companies or individuals have a responsibility to engage themselves for these values? When are, for instance, working conditions and measures for environmental protection sufficient? This is where normative frameworks tend to be vague and open, but that's where our work begins. One thing that we might possibly agree upon is that there are two fundamental aspects of responsibility. The first is knowing what is right and wrong, or in other words, knowing the moral rules that ought to govern our actions. The second is the motivation to actually live up to these norms and guidelines. Here is something to illustrate this. Knowing the 10 Commandments is certainly a prerequisite to heed them. But we may know and accept them and still fail to fulfill them, even without having a bad conscience. This is why some claim that moral motivation is the second necessary ingredient of responsibility. However, there may also be valid constraints that prevent us from doing what we basically consider just and appropriate. For instance, people who are in desperate need of something, like food, medicine, or something like that, may be forced to steal. And business managers, now to change to this domain, have to make their choices under the general constraint of profitability. Therefore, one fundamental question is, and still is, whether and to what extent there can be any ethical responsibility above and beyond what is economically profitable. This may sound like a heretic question to some and like an outdated one to others, since it may recall Friedman's famous statement on social responsibility. But I think it is perhaps more topical than ever, especially if we aim at a view of business ethics that is compatible and integrated with present-day economics. Let us remind ourselves of Carroll's 4 dimensions of CSR. On this account, economic responsibility makes us only take the first step of social responsibilities. And the other 3 steps are thought to take us beyond this narrow frame of reference. However, if we consider, for instance, the ISO 26000, the framework of individual norms on CSR, we learn that the perception of reality of an organization's performance and social responsibility can influence, among other things, its competitive advantage, its reputation, its ability to attract and retain workers or members, customers, clients or users, the maintenance of employees' morale, commitment and productivity, the view of investors, owners, donors, sponsors, and the financial community, and its relationship with companies, governments, the media, suppliers, peers, customers, and community in which it operates. Hey, this all sounds like true benefits for your business, doesn't it? In fact, this is how we typically discuss about CSR today. We try to convince people that implementing CSR in various forms does not spoil, but foster business. This is fine on the one hand, and it tells us that much of our ethical responsibilities have been successfully economically internalized. We have to act in this way to be able to prosper in the future. However, on the other hand, it raises the question of whether, at the end of the day, any ethical engagement would not have to be paying, at least in the long run. Before we discuss about this issue, I would like to make my point even more rigorous and turn to the level of individual agency. After all, we are concerned with the education of individual professionals. You may have come across this four-component model of moral agency that was developed quite some time ago by Jim Rest in the Kohlberg tradition of moral psychology. Just to be sure, I do not want to advocate a traditional Kohlbergian view of moral functioning, although I consider myself a neo-Kohlbergian. However, I will not go into this here and would only like to say that Rest's model of moral agency can be fruitfully used today, in particular if it is adapted in certain ways and supplemented by individual and situational factors, as is the case in Crane and Metton's figure that you can see here. In this Restian model, we rediscover the idea of knowing what is right, moral judgment, supplemented by the idea of moral motivation, that is the commitment to act according to one's moral ideals. And this basic conception of moral responsibility also figures prominently in the work of another famous and influential moral psychologist, Gerhard Minnameier, who held against Kohlberg that moral knowledge is developed fairly early in humans, but what has to develop over a long time, according to her, and what she thinks needs to be promoted in education, is moral motivation, in order to make them morally responsible persons. But now let me come to the crunch of it. Minnameier has invented a tool to measure moral motivation among adolescents and adults, and this tool consists of something we all know, the famous prisoner's dilemma. As you can imagine, cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma indicates high moral motivation, whereas defection indicates low moral motivation. This puts us, at least us business educators, in a serious predicament. We know that the Pareto optimum in the first quadrant is unstable because it is economically rational for every agent to defect, and that therefore agents would have to coordinate in the fourth quadrant, which is Pareto inferior but constitutes a Nash equilibrium. Furthermore, we also know that most people learn very quickly that in the standard condition, defection is what you have to do unless you want to harm yourself. A large body of evidence has revealed that among inexperienced subjects, roughly 50% cooperate and 50% defect at the outset. However, just after 10 rounds of the one-shot game, those 50% from the cooperating camp melt down to a merely 10% of die-hard cooperators. And for them, perhaps cooperation constitutes such a strong value in the payoff that the payoff matrix, which is with its specific utility numbers, may not apply to them, so that for them there is no real dilemma. This shows us that the gravitational force of the game form forces virtually everyone to defect in this game. This is good news, I should add, because it reveals that people tend to be rational after all and to be capable of suitable behavioral adaptations according to the situational constraints. What's more, it is not necessarily bad news for morality, because in slightly different circumstances, moral orientations seem to readily break through. For instance, if the game is played repeatedly, it may be rational to invest in cooperation by playing a tit-for-tat strategy and thus providing positive and negative incentives to cooperate. Furthermore, we know that framing plays an important role. If the prisoner's dilemma is called Wall Street game, we observe an average cooperation by roughly 1/3 of the participants in the repeated game. However, if it is called community game, this rate soars up to an almost magic 2/3. This is interesting for two reasons. Firstly, here I only repeat myself, there seems to be not only situations in which cooperation, or morality for that matter, is crowded out, but also situations in which it is crowded in. Secondly, we may and should ask ourselves what this means from the point of view of rationality. All the way down since the discovery of framing effects by Kahneman and Tversky, framing effects have been interpreted as a feature of human irrationality. Does this mean then that we have to choose between fostering morality at the expense of rationality, where irrational moralists cooperate and rational economists defect? And this in management education? No. Luckily, no. It seems to me that the association of framing effects with irrationality is flawed. And if we see why, we have a clue to a much better and much more coherent understanding of moral responsibility. In a very interesting recent paper, Allingson et al. Have examined whether the framing effects observed in the earlier multi-stage experiment would also show up in the one-shot game. Indeed, in their study with economics freshmen, they have found the same pattern as Lieberman et al. In the repeated game. High cooperation in the community game, low cooperation in the stock market game. Based on the received view, all cooperators would be either irrational or they would have very strong desire to cooperate. However, the author's interpretation based on their empirical findings is different. In the title of their paper, they ask whether social framing effects are due to preferences or to beliefs, and their conclusion is that all is down to beliefs. This means that cooperators are not more morally motivated in the Restian or Nunawinkler sense, are not more sacrificing and more morally committed in their actions than others, but they believe that cooperation might make sense in the community game and less so in the stock market game. What's more, they are also right in their specific assumptions because mutual cooperation is more frequent in the community game than in the stock market game. And therefore differential responses to different frames are not irrational per se, even though the structure of the game is always the same. As I've already mentioned, the distinction between preferences on the one hand and beliefs on the other is crucial for understanding behavioral adaptations and to evaluate them in terms of rationality and responsibility. Unfortunately, this distinction has become blurred in microeconomic theory. Let us see why. The early conceptions of rational choice that came down to us from Hobbes and Hume are quite in line with the points I've just tried to make. According to Hobbes, there are desires that motivate us, and part of our overall set of desires are our moral values and goals. I do not care right now about the fact that moral values are more than just instinctive desires. Rationality then tells us that we should act strategically or efficiently when trying to reach our moral goals. This is good economic and moral thinking, isn't it? Hume, in a similar way, talked about the passions and famously coined the notion of reason as the slave to the passions. However, later rational choice theorizing has led us somehow astray because the distinction between our moral motives and our rational choices has become blurred. This has to do with the history of utilitarian ethics and economic modeling. In the seminal conception by Leonard, desires are translated into preferences over consequences of actions. Choices on their part depend on subjective beliefs that form the constraints to which we have to adapt. However, the difference is still there, and also Kenneth Arrow makes it when he says choices over sets of actions, but preference orderings are over consequences. However, while preferences still depend on our psychological motives and choices depend on subjective beliefs, this theoretically important distinction has lost its significance when Samuel's theory of revealed preference became the new paradigm of microeconomic research. And it has remained the standard in mainstream economics, even in the behavioral and experimental economics camp. I think this is a pity and a problem, because if preferences are revealed from choices, they are not accessible or analyzable anymore in their own right. and in this way the notion of utility has become bleached completely of all psychological content. In particular, this differentiation would be most important in our business ethics educational frame of reference, since our moral goals and principles are expressions of our values, and these form the content of our preferences in the moral domain. From these we have to distinguish our choices in the light of specific situational constraints. Let us take a look back now at the model of moral agency, but this time to an alternative to the Restian model, which was provided roughly at the same time by Kohlberg and one of his co-workers, Daniel Candee. This model has also 4 components, and apart from the first, they are roughly the same except for the different terminology. In particular, moral motivation is now labeled judgment of responsibility. I prefer this label because, firstly, I think it really is about the question of responsibility. That is, whether I or anybody else should feel morally committed to following a certain moral precinct or a certain course of action in a specific situation, like the various versions of the prisoner's dilemma. Secondly, we really talk about a judgment here, whether one should or should not follow a certain course of action. It is not about some spooky motivation, the sources of which have always remained in the dark. In a recent reconstruction of this model of moral agency, I have suggested that we should stop thinking of one single moral judgment complemented by moral motivation, but to extend our notion of moral judgment so that it encompasses these different aspects of an overall moral judgment. In fact, I assume that there are even 3 kinds of judgments taking place, and I differentiate these according to an inferential system that goes back to the pragmatist philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, who distinguishes between abduction, deduction, and induction. Put in simple words, this means that whenever we encounter a moral problem, we first have to come up with a plausible principle, or in the simplest case, with an idea of a course of action that makes sense. Maybe also that several possible alternatives stand to consideration. This is abductive reasoning. On its basis, we can deductively derive what we would have to do if we really followed a certain moral precinct. However, whatever we derive does not immediately compel us. This is why Kohlberg's heading decision-making is inadequate to my mind. We can still evaluate the consequences in terms of whether the suggested course of action is sensible or not. In this light, it might be rational to accept a particular alternative, or it might as well be rational to reject it. In the Kohlberg-Candee model, we start from the activation of moral principles from which we deductively derive deontic judgments, not yet choices in the narrow sense. Responsibility judgments then are concerned with our beliefs that determine our final choices. This takes us back to the model as we find it in Crane and Matten, and we can now see how personal and situational factors enter the scene. Personal factors, on the one hand, are, for instance, the state of moral development and subjective personal values that determine personal utilities or our preferences. Situational factors, on the other hand, influence our beliefs about what might come out of certain actions and the probabilities of these outcomes. Now, we as management educators have to distinguish at least these 2 aspects when we want to judge whether a person is responsible or not, or when we want to determine what an ideally responsible person should do. One aspect is whether the person has the right values and moral principles and a clear understanding of what suitable ethical aims are. The other aspect is whether and how these aims are best achieved and what can be sensibly required from a person or from a company. What should we learn from this? To my mind, we can draw a few important conclusions. First, moral motivation, in my view, has to do with our moral preferences, not with our choices, when we adapt to situational constraints. Calling for responsibility in the sense of ignoring the constraints, is misled. Second, responsibility properly understood means instead that moral persons work out how they can best achieve their moral goals, so they have to think strategically and economically when maximizing their moral utilities. Hence, responsible moral persons have to be utility maximizers in the sense I've just described. The final question that I leave to you to discuss is whether and to what extent managers are in a position to set moral goals and pursue them, or whether they shouldn't just take their stakeholders' values as input and try to maximize their utilities. However, if you think that managers just have to act according to the company's stakeholders' values as best as they can, then their job and their responsibility is an economic one, properly understood, and nothing else. Well, here I'm almost at the end. This is the morale of my story. And I thank you very much for listening.